Hi guys. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about solitude and Sabbath, the topic for our sessions 8 and 9, coming out of Reggie McNeil's book, Practicing Greatness, where he uses the term, the discipline of aloneness. But we use solitude and Sabbath. Before getting into that though, I want to talk about a study I've seen referenced a couple of times out of Virginia Tech, most recently in Michael Easter's book, Comfort Crisis. He talks about this study where volunteers are asked to come into a room and spend just a few minutes in what we'll call a solitude session away from electronic devices, sitting alone in their thoughts. And during this time, they could either sit with their thoughts or opt to push a button that led to a fairly significant electric shock. And we found that men fared considerably worse than women in this exercise, with fully 2/3 of the volunteers deciding to take that shock rather than to sit alone with their thoughts for just a brief 15-minute exercise. For me, it's just another data point as we contemplate how distracted we all are and our need for that constant stimulus, that constant dopamine hit, as they say, in our lives. And it's not unlike what we experience just waiting in line. How often have you stood in line somewhere and inevitably picked up the phone, scrolling through emails or looking at social media? And I want to talk just a little bit about what healthy rhythms might look like as we think about solitude and Sabbath and ways in which we might push back from those electronic sorts of stimulus that so often control our lives. Let me start by asking you the question as to what your current practices around solitude and Sabbath look like. This is certainly an area for me that I find challenging, and I continue to work on my rhythms in this area, and would invite you to do the same as we think about this for just a moment. I've found it interesting the way some pastors are now framing this for the term, and perhaps you have, rule of life. And what is that rule of life? It's something that we all have. It's those regular rhythms that we experience, those things that we might do in the morning on a daily basis, or in the evening with our family, perhaps on a Friday night, Saturday. What do those look like? I liked how one pastor recently encouraged me by asking, what are your rhythms? What is your rule of life? And what is that forming in you? That was Pastor Rich Viotis out of New York Church. And you may know that Rich is the successor to Pete Scazzero. And he's been a strong advocate for solitude, for Sabbath, for the idea of contemplative prayer. And he frames it this way. I really love this structure. He talks about our need to normalize boredom, our need to befriend silence, and our need to think about reframing those distractions that we might experience in times of solitude. Normalizing boredom and befriending silence, those two are fairly self-explanatory, although often really difficult to embrace. But I want to talk just a little bit about this idea of reframing distractions as he thinks about sitting in those spaces, those moments of solitude, and what might it look like if, instead of looking at the distraction as something that's shameful or negative, we reframe it by suggesting that it's just yet another opportunity to return our attention to Christ. So if we're distracted 100 times during a moment of solitude or time of prayer, it's 100 opportunities to return to Christ and reframe our attention on Him. I want to start with a quote from Thomas Merton. Merton would suggest that the opposite of a contemplative life is not an active life, but rather a reactive life. Essentially suggesting that when we are not taking time to be grounded, to have a regular walk with the Lord, that we are entering into a space where we become more reactive to those things around us rather than feeling a sense of groundedness. The other quote that I'll wrap up on is, again, from Rich Viotis, where Viotis would say that keeping Sabbath is not a way for us to become more productive during our work week, but it's rather a way for us to push back against the idol of productivity. I think about how this relates significantly to the work that we've been doing in Rock Solid, and as we think specifically about identity. Where is it that our identity is grounded? Are we grounding our identity in our work? I'm sure you've all experienced, as I have, the social interactions that we often see. How are you doing these days? The often answer is, well, I'm really busy. The sense that we wear our busyness as almost a badge of success. And I want to encourage us to rethink this just a bit and recognize that our identity is so much greater than what it is we produce. So guys, I'd encourage you to be thinking about these practices, these ways in which we might encourage others to embrace solitude, embrace Sabbath, embrace a rule of life. Too often, we find our identity in our busyness. If you aren't already pushing back against this, perhaps consider ways in which you can, and ways in which we can encourage those around the table in our groups to do the same. Might we ask ourselves, what is your rule of life forming in you? May God strengthen each of us as we continue to pursue Him. Be blessed.